Please, thank you. Oh, officer, if you're asked to stand up, would you please stand up in the witness box and not move? We're getting some reflection. One of the reporters thought that the juror was pictured, but it wasn't. We looked at it, and I think it was the court reporter.
Okay.
Okay? Okay, good morning. Please be seated. All right, Mr. Ng, you may cross.
Morning, Sergeant Peterson.
Morning.
My name is Paul Ng. We met once before. I have some questions for you on behalf of former Officer Potter.
Okay.
You started your testimony yesterday by discussing why you became a trainer.
Yes.
And one of the reasons you mentioned yesterday was that you wanted to be safe.
Correct.
Safe meaning your own safety, correct?
Mine and that of my partners.
And you wanted your fellow officers on the street to be safe?
Yes.
And you also wanted to be wanted the community to be safe that you serve.
Yes.
Okay. And specifically, you've trained officers so that you can trust what they do in times of need, your need, the needs of other officers as well. Is that correct?
Correct.
You're training them to make a split-second decision
Yes.
in what can be very dangerous circumstances.
Yes.
Okay? And you're training them to, if you were at risk, that you would want them to be making an instant decision on your behalf. Is that correct?
Can you repeat?
You'd want them to make the right decision for you if you were in harm's way, right?
Correct.
Which is a key motivation for you.
Yes.
And the purpose of training is many things, but one of the reasons you train is that police work is risky.
Correct.
You're dealing with a public that sometimes can be very dangerous,
Yes.
can be armed,
Yes.
and can be unpredictable in their behaviors.
Yes.
And there is a need then to react quickly to what an officer sees. Is that correct?
Correct.
And what you train in an omnibus way is for them to be to have the tools they need to respond. Is that correct?
Correct.
To respond quickly,
Yes.
and then you leave them with a certain amount of discretion to make that decision depending on individual circumstances. Okay?
Absolutely.
Now, Officer Potter attended your classes that you've described. Is that correct?
She has.
She was an attentive student, right?
Yes.
She fully participated in all your scenarios. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. She didn't miss any of your classes or skip out.
If she missed them, she wouldn't have been on a roster,
Right, but-
and then she would have had to make up that training.
Yeah, but if she's on your roster, she attended.
Correct.
And you knew that she was an FTO, is that correct?
I did.
And an FTO is a field training officer,
Yes.
and the field training officer on the street has a number of duties, is that correct?
Yes.
And the it's there are a lot of things. There are a lot more things going on for a field training officer than just an officer on the street ordinarily. Is that correct?
Yes.
I mean, you have this is obvious to you, but you have supervisory capacities, right?
As a field training officer, you certainly do.
You have the evaluation capacities, right?
Yes.
And all of a sudden you have two officers on the street thinking perhaps different things.
Correct.
Now, this Taser 7 that we've talked about, this was a new product, was it not?
For our department, yes.
And it just came out. You just bought some, right?
Yeah, we had just purchased them in the beginning of 2020.
Okay. And,
I'm sorry, 2021.
2021. You have no evidence that she ever used the Taser in the field, do you? You'd certainly know about it if she did.
I would know about it if she did, yes.
And you have no evidence that she did, right?
No.
Okay. But these new Tasers were in working order.
They were?
And I assume they're like every other new product. There are certain advancements or improvements compared to the old product, right?
That's the reason we would have gone to a new product.
And would it be fair to say that the battery capacity of the new Taser would be at least similar or better than the older Taser in play? Is that correct?
Better.
And the battery capacity lasts a while, does it not?
Yes.
I mean, it doesn't need to be charged every day,
It does not have to be, no.
especially if it's not used. Is that correct?
Correct.
And the last training that she received on the Taser 7 was on March 2nd,
I believe so. That was the date that she was there.
but she didn't get her gun until later in March, like the 26th, according to the records.
Do you mean a taser?
Yeah, the Taser, I'm sorry.
Yeah. It wasn't until a little bit later that month that we were actually able to deploy the tasers to the field.
She was the first one to get it, right?
One of a group, I believe.
And by contrast to the new Taser, the firearm that she had was a semi-automatic,
Correct?
a Glock.
Yes.
And that Glock has been around the police world in which you have it for decades now. Is that correct?
The product has been around for a really long time. That specific one, we had changed out to a new fleet of handguns in 2012, I think it was.
Okay. So she'd had that gun for almost 10 years.
Around that, yeah.
And it was the same kind of gun.
Similar
I
in
mean,
function,
it's not
yes.
an electronic gun. It's just a handgun. I don't say just a handgun. It's a handgun that's built similarly for the last decades, 20, 30 years ago.
Yes.
I mean, they used this kind of mechanism in World War II.
Yes.
And that was the Glock, or a similar gun to the Glock that she had been trained on repeatedly by you and by the department. Is that correct?
Yes.
It's the Glock that she had on this person that she went to the firing range on a regular basis. Is that correct?
Yes.
And did all the other trainings that you had with her. Is that correct?
Yes.
Now, the training that you have in tasers is such that you try to get close to what it's like in real life to use them and what the officers face. Is that correct?
As close as we can in the training session, yes.
But you never can quite reach that level, of course, right?
Never will be able to.
Okay. So you do the best you can do.
Correct.
Okay. I mean, you can't, for example, replicate a car taking off.
That would not be safe in a training environment.
You can't replicate an officer who is inside a car that might take off. Is that correct?
Not practically. In talking about it, we do, but
Yeah,
not.
but you'd never put someone in harm's way during training, obviously, right?
No.
Okay. And you know from your training, you tell the officers that every response by the individual officer will be unique, right?
Can you say that again?
Every officer will respond in a unique way to the training. Is that right?
Correct.
I mean, everyone has different blood pressures that go up, right?
Yes.
Everyone has different reactions to adrenaline.
Correct.
And officers see different things at different times during your training exercises, right?
Absolutely.
And even during all your training, you recognize that certain officers take different routes and exercise discretion differently. Is that right?
Correct.
And there may not be any one right answer.
Correct.
In fact, some of your training exercises are designed so there may not be a right answer.
Yes.
And lately with COVID, it's been difficult to have in-person trainings. I think you mentioned that yesterday.
It has been extremely difficult.
I mean, you used to use volunteers, as I understand it, strangers, so that the officers wouldn't know who they are, right?
Not strangers, but civilians in our department.
Okay. But that's not really possible nowadays.
We're getting a little more back to normal, but still not where we were 2 years ago.
But even earlier this year, it wasn't advisable.
No.
Okay. And that's why you had a training session on March 2nd involving you
Correct.
as a subject, because it was the safest thing to do in light of COVID and the restrictions you were under. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you talked about scenario training yesterday.
Yes.
Scenario training would be where the officers are required to react to a certain situation where there's a person. Isn't that right?
Yes.
And you yourself on March 2nd created 2 scenarios where the officers would react. Isn't that right?
I did.
Okay. And it's the only training on a scenario that was given for the Taser 7. Am I right about that?
Can you rephrase?
Was March 2nd the only training given on the Taser 7?
Yes.
Okay. So you were the person who was acting in such a way that would provoke a police officer to decide to do something, right?
During the scenarios, yes.
And I think one of them was you came out of a closet or some doorway with a club in your hand. Am I right about that?
It was a bat.
It was a bat. And then you motioned the bat towards the officer, and they had to decide what to do, right?
Correct.
Okay. Whether it be a taser or a gun, right?
Or any of their other tools that they had on their person.
Okay. And some of the officers shot you with a taser.
Some did.
Some shot you with a gun.
None shot me with a gun.
Okay. But in any event, the exercise was the best you could do, but the officers knew who you were,
They did.
and a lot of them are friends of yours.
Yes.
It's a tight-knit department,
Very.
and they knew that you weren't going to try to kill them.
Yeah.
They knew you weren't going to take flight.
Yes.
They knew you weren't high.
Correct.
They knew you didn't have a bench warrant.
Correct.
They knew you didn't have a gun.
A real gun, yes.
And they knew you didn't have an access to the gun around your person.
Correct.
And they knew that you weren't going to use a gun. Real gun.
Yes. Okay.
And they knew you weren't going to hurt them.
Correct.
Now, one of the things you do in training is talk about the policies of your department. Is that right?
Some of the policies, not all.
And yesterday we talked about the Taser policy, which is number 304.
Yes.
Okay. And I don't think I need to show it on the screen, but I do want to ask you some questions about it. That was Exhibit 334.
Okay.
Okay. And you've almost memorized this, haven't you, over the years?
Not verbatim, but I have a general idea how to put it in practice.
I mean, you've talked about this hundreds of times.
Yes.
And the early part of the policy is at 304.3, and it says the officer shall, the verb is shall, only use a taser device that has been issued by the department, right?
Correct.
Okay. So you want to control what they use. They can't buy their own.
Correct.
Okay. And then also in that section it says the officer shall carry the taser device on the reaction side. Is that right?
Correct.
And then in the middle, we've had a discussion here. It said members, quote, members carrying the taser should perform a spark test on the unit prior to every shift. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay. A should is the verb, and it differs from shall as a verb, right?
Yes.
Okay. And should is an aspirational verb. And in other words, you encourage the officers to test and do a spark test before every shift, right?
Correct.
It doesn't always happen.
It does not.
And there are a lot of things going on. In fact, we have testimony that on 4 of 6 shifts it didn't happen with Officer Potter, right?
Correct.
And it hasn't happened with other officers too.
Correct.
And you're not She was never reprimanded, or you never talked to her, for example, about, well, do a spark test. You missed a couple, I assume.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
Can you repeat the question?
Well, I mean, did you ever talk to her about missing a couple spark tests?
No.
I mean, that's not something you usually talk to the officers about.
No.
Okay. And the fact of the matter is the machine worked. I mean, the gun worked. The taser worked, right?
Yes.
Okay. And also in this section 304, you talk about verbal warnings that must be given to the subject who may be tased. Is that correct?
Yes.
And the idea here in the policy is the individual should be warned, if possible, that a taser may be employed. Is that correct?
Correct.
In fact, it says a verbal warning of the intended use should precede its application, right?
Correct.
It doesn't say shall, it doesn't say required, right?
Correct.
And the reason you do a warning, you teach everyone, including former Officer Potter, is that you want to provide the individual with notice that something may be happening, right?
Yes.
I mean, you've been tased, it's painful.
It is.
You don't want to repeat it.
Correct.
It's designed to disable you.
Yes.
And even a big guy like you were disabled temporarily.
Yes.
So the reason you give a warning is to provide the individual with an opportunity to comply, right?
Correct.
I mean, the hope is that they will.
Always is the hope.
And then you want to provide a warning that it may indeed be deployed. Isn't that correct?
Yes.
So a typical warning that you teach is, I'll tase you. I'll tase you.
Correct.
And it's said in a vocal, loud way, so the subject will understand what you're talking about, right?
In plain English, yes.
So it's consistent when someone's going to use a taser to say, I'll tase you, I'll tase you.
Yes.
That's what the department wants someone to do.
It's one of the many things that we teach them to say.
And then there's a section on application of the taser, 304.5.1, that permits the use of the taser or suggests the taser can be used, right?
Yes.
Under certain circumstances.
Yes.
And one of the circumstances is if the subject is violent
Yes.
or is physically resisting.
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I mean, if someone is resisting a cuffing and attempts to get back into a car, for example, that person can be tased.
Yes.
Or you can also tase, according to your policy, not you, but an officer that you train, if the subject has demonstrated by words or action an intention to be violent. Correct?
Correct.
Or to physically resist. Right?
Yes.
Or if that person is a potential harm to others.
Yes.
So all those factors can be considered
Yes.
in employing the taser.
In a very short amount of time.
In fact, the decision I'm glad you mentioned that. The decision to use a taser is really quick.
The decision to use any.
The objection? Well, I'll let the answer stand. You can finish what you were going to say.
Any use of force has to be made in a very short amount of time.
But what you don't want to use a taser if someone's physically running away from you necessarily.
Necessarily, but it's not an absolute no.
Okay. And you don't want to use a taser if a car is moving.
Correct, moving.
But if a car, on the other hand, is stationary.
We've used it many times on people inside vehicles that are stationary.
And one of the things you teach is whether the individual has, quote-unquote, control over the motor vehicle, right?
Yes.
And the rule that you teach, I think, and you tell me if I'm wrong, is that if the individual doesn't have control over the car, the taser would be appropriate.
It certainly could be depending on the circumstances.
And again, you rely on the officer's discretion to make that decision.
Yes.
Now, we also heard a lot of testimony about taser warnings. One of the warnings was in Exhibit 270. You recognize this kind of thing, don't you?
Yes.
Okay, you've seen this dozens of times.
Yes.
And this is a warning that's issued by the taser manufacturer, as I understand it.
Correct?
It's made by Axon, is that right?
Yeah, that is the company that distributes the taser products.
And they warn about all sorts of things that can go wrong when you're using a taser.
Lots of things.
And this purpose of this warning that you showed us yesterday is to have the person undergoing training release the taser company from liability in case something goes wrong during training using the taser.
That specific document?
Not this was specific one, but in general, that's why they sign these releases, right?
That's why they sign the training form that I then sign later certifying that they can carry a taser.
So the training form not only recognizes their completion of treatment, but releases the taser company from liability during the training.
Correct.
And one of the warnings of this document, 270, that we saw is that there can be a confusion between a taser and a handgun.
Yes.
And there is a recognition thus by the company that makes these things that there can indeed be a confusion between the two.
Yes.
Otherwise, why warn you, right?
Right.
And there have been confusions between tasers and guns
Several.
across the country.
Yes.
And in fact, the taser is shaped, at least on a handle basis, like a gun, right?
It is?
It has a trigger, right?
Yes.
The handle may be smaller, but it's
Yes.
still a gun handle,
To fit into a hand, correct.
especially a smaller hand.
Any hand.
And one of the reasons the taser manufacturer releases or wants all these releases is that they know, and you know from training, that mistakes can happen.
Correct.
Mistakes can happen during training when someone is trying to use a taser.
Yes.
And mistakes can happen when someone confuses a taser with a gun.
Correct.
And it can be an innocent mistake.
Certainly can be.
The objection is sustained. And the answer, the jury will disregard that asked question and answer.
And in every training exercise you do, there are these release and warning requirements. This is Exhibit 369 from yesterday. Do you see this? You recognize this, don't you?
I recognize it, yes.
I mean, this is it's a training and warning requirement that is insisted upon by Taser, the Axon Enterprises that makes it, right?
Correct.
In fact, you are constrained during training to do exactly what Taser wants you to do.
Exactly what they want us to do.
And that's a precondition of even owning or using the Taser itself, right?
I'm not sure if it's a requirement of owning it, but it is a requirement of us going through instructor training.
Okay, got it. Now, you also teach in use of tasers and use of force of the various statutes from Minnesota, do you not?
I do.
And I've looked at your training materials, and one of the statutes referenced is Minnesota Statute 609.06. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, that's the statute that permits reasonable force to be used towards an individual under certain circumstances. Isn't that right?
Of an officer and other people in the state of Minnesota, yes.
But it's designed to give some clarity to what an officer can do vis-a-vis a reasonable force.
Correct.
And it gives criteria or examples of what can be used in reasonable force by the officer, right?
Yes.
And you teach this,
Yes.
almost with your eyes closed,
Depending on the day.
after all these years.
Yeah.
And the statute says that reasonable force may be used towards a person without the other's consent when the following circumstances exist or the actor reasonably believes them to exist. And the circumstances include, for a police officer at least, in effectuating a lawful arrest. Correct?
Yes.
In the execution of legal process.
Yes.
In the enforcement of an order for the court. Is that correct?
Correct.
Such as a bench warrant.
Yes.
Or in executing any other duty imposed by the public officer by law. Is that correct?
Correct.
So you can use reasonable force to make an arrest if
Yes.
the circumstances permit, correct?
Yes.
Objection has to be answered.
The objection is overruled. I'll let the answer stand.
And you can use reasonable force to enforce an order of the court.
Yes.
A bench warrant is an order of the court, right?
Yes.
Directing you as a police officer to make an arrest of the individual.
Correct.
I mean, a judge has directed you to do that.
Yes.
And as a part of your obligations as a police officer, you're to honor that bench warrant.
Yes.
You just can't close your eyes to it.
No.
And then there are criteria, according to your outlines, which I've read too, on the factors to be considered when you judge what a reasonable force should be used. And one of the factors is the threat, the possible threat of the arrestee, right?
Correct.
How fast it occurs.
Yes.
Whether the arrestee is high or impaired.
Yes.
The seriousness of the offense.
Yes.
By the way, is fleeing a police officer a felony in Minnesota
It depends how they're fleeing.
in a car?
That is a felony.
Is it in Minnesota a dangerous offense in your view?
Objection, Your Honor, foundation.
The objection is sustained.
Well, does fleeing a police officer at a high rate of speed suggest to you a certain amount of dangerousness?
Objection, Your Honor, relevance and foundation.
Well, the objection is overruled. You may answer that.
Can you repeat?
Well, does fleeing an officer in a car at a high rate of speed suggest to you a certain amount of dangerousness?
Yes.
And why is that?
It puts the person driving that car, the officer, and the general public at risk in their attempts to evade the officer.
And the public's at risk because, as you've seen in your career, the individual fleeing a police officer can crash.
Yes.
Often does.
Frequently.
Kill somebody.
Can.
And that's why it's so dangerous.
Yes.
And it's important in making an arrest to prevent that sort of thing from happening.
Yes.
That's your obligation as a police officer, right?
Correct.
Now, you also teach another statute on the use of deadly force. I know you're here for Taser, but I want to ask you a couple questions about it. All right?
Sure.
And that's statute 609.066, is that right?
Correct.
And that permits the officer to use deadly force under certain circumstances. Okay?
Correct.
And you teach this.
We do.
And the circumstances involve an apparent risk of if there's an apparent risk of great bodily harm or death
Yes.
to the officer herself or
Yes.
himself, right?
Yes.
To the other officers on the scene
Correct.
or the community nearby.
Correct.
And if there is an apparent threat of death or great bodily harm, deadly force can be used to prevent an escape or facilitate the capture.
Can you repeat?
If there is an apparent risk of great bodily harm, can deadly force under this statute be used to effectuate an arrest or prevent an escape?
Yes.
And when you evaluate the use of a deadly force, you teach that it's a decision that's made right there and then.
Correct.
It's not the subject of hindsight.
Correct.
It's not whether someone would have done something differently after the fact.
Correct.
It's not the subject of a 20/20 vision.
Correct.
And it's a decision that's made under rapidly evolving circumstance, right?
Yes.
That's right out of Graham versus Connor, which you teach too.
Correct.
And finally, the decision is made at the very moment the force is used. Is that correct?
Yes.
And it's what was known to the officer at that moment.
Correct.
You also teach that the stressors involved in critical incidents, as you mentioned, vary from officer to officer, right?
Could you repeat that?
The stressors vary from officer to officer.
Correct.
One officer may freeze, for example.
Hopefully not.
You train not to, right?
Correct.
You train action.
Yes.
You train make a decision
Yes.
at the spur of the moment.
Yes.
Even if it's the wrong one, you make a decision.
Yes.
Because if you wait, that can be deathly too.
For multiple people.
Now, you have not, in your capacity as a witness, seen any of the videos in this case, I think, right?
Only small snippets months ago.
All right. So, in fact, you haven't wanted to because you knew you were going to testify as a trainer.
Correct.
Okay. So you didn't want that to be in your brain, so to speak.
Correct.
And you knew it, once you saw it, it wouldn't leave you.
Yes.
Because you knew everybody here. You knew everybody in the video.
Very well.
Now, but you do teach officers that, where there's a warrant for a gun charge, they should make the arrest. Am I correct? If there's a bench warrant.
Can you say that again?
Where the suspect has a bench warrant for a gun charge, they should make an arrest.
Yes.
They can't let him go.
No.
You also teach that when a gun is involved on a bench warrant, that the officer should be vigilant about another gun being in the car at issue,
Absolutely.
or a gun being on the person. Is that correct?
Yes.
And you train this over and over again, right?
Yes.
Because stopping someone in a car is one of the most dangerous things you can do.
Yes.
And police officers who aren't vigilant and are not aware of the dangers can be shot.
Yes.
Have been
Yes.
in Minnesota.
Yes.
Just because a gun isn't found later in the car at issue doesn't mean the officer's interest in or belief a gun is there is invalid, though.
Objection or relevance?
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
You want me to repeat that?
Please do.
Just because a gun isn't found doesn't mean to you that the officer's interest or belief a gun may be in the car is invalid.
It would not be invalid.
And just because the arrestee doesn't have a gun on his person, the officer is still reasonable in his belief or her belief that a gun may be there, or a gun would have been there, or could have been there.
They'd be reasonable in that belief, yes.
And you also teach during all these lessons that you have is that there are certain community interests in play in making arrests.
Yes.
And one of the interests in the community is the safety of all the innocent citizens, right?
Correct?
Of course, it is to prevent harm to the officers.
Yes.
That's a community interest.
Yes.
It's to ensure public safety.
Yes.
It's to ensure a driver who's not supposed to drive doesn't drive anymore.
Yes.
I mean, you got to have a license to drive.
In the state of Minnesota, yes.
It's unsafe to drive without one.
Yes.
It's unsafe to drive without insurance,
Yes.
because that's a requirement too, right?
Of the state, yes.
And another community interest is to validate court orders, right?
Yes.
If the guy's not supposed to be on the street, he's got to get off the street.
If that's what the court said, yes.
Is the use of a taser a form of de-escalation, in your view?
Yes.
Meaning that it can de-escalate the situation by incapacitating the defendant or the suspect, right?
Or other ways, yes.
So you're taught to use the taser to de-escalate a situation, fair?
Yes.
You're also taught. You also teach that you can't always predict the arrestee's behavior.
Correct.
Now I want you to. I know you haven't seen the video, but I want to give you a hypothetical and ask whether the use of the taser would have been appropriate. Okay?
Okay.
Let's suppose that an individual's driving a car. He is stopped for legitimate reason. Let us further suppose that when asked for a license, the individual doesn't have a license. He doesn't have any identification. There's no insurance current on the car. Let's further assume that the individual has a bench warrant for a gun charge. And let's assume further that there's an order for protection against him, and then there's a female in the car, and a female is listed on the order for protection. Okay? And let's assume further that when the individual police officer in my scenario tells the individual to get out of the car and tells him further that he's under arrest, and the individual resists arrest. And the individual is told by another officer on the scene, I'll tase you, I'll tase you. The individual climbs back in the car that's stationary, but attempts to engage the car. It is not moving. Under those circumstances that I've outlined for you, would it be reasonable for an officer to fire a taser to stop this individual?
Your Honor, I'm going to object on calls for speculation, foundation.
The objection is overruled, and you may answer.
If that
You also teach, I've got just a couple more questions for you. I appreciate your answers. You also teach that mistakes can happen in police work.
Objection, Your Honor.
The objection is overruled. You may answer.
mistakes can happen in every part of our world.
Accidents can happen.
Yes.
They're no matter how hard you train, no matter how hours you put into it, policing and living is a human endeavor.
There are too many variables to have planned out in advance to be able to eliminate that